Okay, I'd like to welcome everybody, the panelists and the viewers here for this first webinar in a series of 3 webinars in response to the current drought situation here in Tennessee and the Southeast and beyond. We have several panelists on here from UT Extension, and they're going to talk to us today about nutritional management during drought conditions. So Jason Smith is going to start with talking about some general considerations and extending hay and pasture, as you see here on this first slide, for beef cattle production. Jennie Ivey is going to follow that after that with discussion on horses and equine species on how to do some similar type things and manage to a drought situation. And we also have Peter Krawczel, who's a dairy extension specialist at the Animal Science Department, and Dwight Loveday, who does a lot of work with our small ruminant extension type activities here at the UT Extension. So they'll be on here to answer questions that come up specific to dairy production or to small ruminant production. So again, this is being recorded now, and we'll post these on our drought response website so people can go back and look at these. We did a pretty short turnaround between the between publicizing these webinars and actually starting them, but really the main thrust, and we're glad that you're here watching live today, and encourage you to ask questions as we go along in the chat box. But really the main reason for doing this quick turnaround is to have these recorded so people can go back and watch those at the website later today. All right, so I'm going to turn this over first to Jason in the interest of time, and go ahead and let him get started. Jason.
All right, thank you, Justin, and welcome everyone. So as Justin mentioned, I'm gonna focus on methods of extending hay resources or pasture resources, while also trying to conserve any productivity that we can during drought conditions for ruminants. Now, most of what I'll present will be centered on beef cattle, but if we're raising ruminant livestock in a pasture type setting, a lot of these concepts will apply across the board. So some of the specific things that I'm going to talk about are methods of reducing hay waste, substitution with some supplemental feedstuffs. I'll talk about supplementation, focus on energy and protein, and then mineral supplementation, limit feeding, utilizing crop residues, sorting cattle into groups based upon their nutrient requirements, early weaning, and then finally I'll mention a few things about strategic culling, which Justin Reinhardt is going to cover in much more detail at a later date. So the first of those that I mentioned, and I think this is probably one of the major ways that we can help to extend our hay resources, is to reduce hay waste. And if we're currently feeding hay in a round bale or a hay feeder and providing cattle with 24-hour a day, 7-day a week, free choice access to that hay, generally that's going to result in 25% or more of that hay being wasted. So what that means is that, generally speaking, they only eat 3 out of every 4 bales that we put in front of them. So some ways that, even if we are going to feed hay in a hay feeder, that we can decrease or minimize some of that hay waste, would be to segregate a feeding area with polywire and only allow cattle to eat for 6 or 12 hours per day. Now, more often than not, they will consume the total amount that they really need to for that day in a much shorter time period than that. So if we can give them 6 or 12 hours, we can substantially decrease that hay waste, maybe even cut it in half or even less. One of the other things that will help in that scenario will be placing that hay and its feeder on a clean feeding pad that has a solid foundation. That's going to decrease the amount of mud and manure that hay that's pulled out of the feeder winds up being mixed with, and thus decrease the amount that's wasted. Now, another way that we can reduce hay waste, if we're not tied to necessarily using that round bale feeder, is unrolling hay on the ground. Now, this is a more labor-intensive practice that's only going to be effective if we do it every day, or at most every other day. But if we can effectively match the amount that we're feeding to the amount that the animals will consume before the next feeding, we can substantially decrease hay waste. And then we get some other benefits that come along with that. We get organic matter dispersion, we get manure dispersion. We tend to give cattle, once it starts to get cold, a place to get off of the ground, especially for newborn calves. Big thing to keep in mind here, though, is that if we unroll a week's worth of hay, that's generally going to result in more hay waste than if we were to give cattle 24-hour a day, 7-day a week access to consume hay out of round bale feeders. So in order for unrolling hay to work in terms of reducing hay waste, we need to be doing it every day or every other day, and then matching the amount that we're feeding to the amount that we know they'll consume. All right. One of the next topics that I mentioned I discussed is substitution. So there's this concept in ruminant nutrition known as substitution rate. And really what that's based on is the fact that some feedstuffs, based upon their nutrient content, decrease voluntary hay consumption. So the feedstuffs that we know do a really good job at that are going to be our grain, more starchy type feedstuffs like wheat, barley, and corn, and then some of our corn byproducts, distillers grains, and hominy feed. Okay, so substitution rate is generally somewhere in the vicinity of 2 to 1 in terms of the ratio. So what that means is that for every 2 pounds of dry matter, per se, from corn that we feed to the cattle or other ruminants, that's going to decrease hay consumption by roughly 1 pound of dry matter. Now, that substitution rate increases disproportionately as level of supplementation increases. So if we increase, as we increase level of supplementation of some of these feedstuffs, that's going to result in a greater effect on the amount of hay that is saved. So that's going to cause those animals to disproportionately consume less hay. But generally speaking, the rate that we go with is 2 to 1. Now, that concept does not hold true for all supplemental feedstuffs. So there are some feedstuffs that will not decrease voluntary hay consumption or may even increase voluntary hay consumption, especially when we start talking about low and medium quality hay. So those that may do that would be soy hulls, soybean meal, cottonseed meal, and corn gluten feed. But the reality is that regardless of what feed ingredient or feedstuff it is, when we feed it at a high level, so somewhere above 1 to 1.5% of body weight, any feedstuff is going to decrease voluntary hay consumption. Now, the thing that's important to note there, though, is that at high levels of supplementation, more often than not, that's generally going to be too expensive to justify it. It may be more economical for us just to purchase more hay than that amount of supplemental feedstuff. And the other thing that we have to keep in mind is that with some of these feedstuffs, we can cause problems if we start to feed them at a very high level. And general rule of thumb for most of our commodity byproducts is we try and stay below 25 or 30% of the overall dry matter that the cattle are consuming. All right, protein and energy supplementation. Low and medium quality forages are, regardless of whether we're in a drought or not, are almost always going to need to be supplemented with protein and energy to avoid any negative implications on production. All right, those supplements need to be able to fill the nutrient void that remains. So the amount of nutrients that hay is not going to provide to the animal that they need in order to avoid sacrificing productivity. Okay, so some of those options that were previously mentioned that will decrease voluntary hay consumption are also very good, especially distillers grains, when we start looking at the value of a supplemental feedstuff. If we need something that's gonna provide a lot of protein, a lot of energy, and also help decrease voluntary hay consumption, it's almost always going to be one of our best options. The other thing, if we're just interested in decreasing hay consumption and supplementing energy, and that hay has plenty of protein in it, then corn is going to be a really, really competitive option this year, especially if we look at the corn futures market. All right. One of the things we need to keep in mind when we're making some of these selection decisions is that we need to consider both nutrient content. So is that supplemental feedstuff, does it contain a high enough amount of this nutrient to actually provide the level that the animal needs to complement that hay. The other thing that we have to consider is supplement value. All right, notice how I didn't say supplement cost. Okay, retail price and value are very rarely the same thing, so we need to look at how valuable these supplements are to complementing our forages. And we have a few supplemental feedstuff value calculators that calculate the cost per unit of nutrients, so how much it costs us to get a pound of crude protein or a pound of TDN or a megacalorie of net energy for maintenance, for example, from these different options. Okay, and they essentially level the playing field and standardize that nutrient content so we can get a valid cost comparison across those. So those are available for free download online at utbeef.com under the nutrition section. And we also have an extension publication, SP 793, that can be used if you're interested, or can be referenced if you have more interest in that topic. All right, you get a lot of questions now and moving into the winter about protein tubs and liquid feeds. Okay, these are often marketed to extend hay resources. Now, the thing we have to keep in mind here is that protein supplementation will generally increase the utilization of low or medium quality forages. They do that because supplemental protein tends to boost the environment in terms of the microorganisms in the rumen and enhance digestibility. Notice how I'm focusing on increasing utilization and increasing digestibility. Those do not mean decreases in voluntary hay consumption. And a lot of times what we'll see is actually an increase in hay consumption. Okay, some of the considerations that we have to make here are, is that product an all-natural or not an all-natural protein product? So does it contain a considerable amount of non-protein nitrogen? And most often that's going to be in the form of urea. Okay, if it is a conventional, so not an all-natural type product, we're going to need to supplement some additional carbohydrates in order for it to be effective at increasing hay utilization or even being turned into true protein in the animal. And generally speaking, that carbohydrate right now, again, from a cost standpoint, is probably corn is going to be our best option. Okay. One of the other things we need to consider is formulation specific intake regulation. So most of these products are going to be formulated so that when fed free choice, cattle or other ruminants will only consume a certain amount of them. So the question we have to ask is, will they consume enough to make a difference? Now, our liquid feed supplements, they tend to be higher intake type supplements, and most of those may be rated at anywhere from 1 to 5 or 6 pounds per head per day. Now, if we look at our tubs, for example, they tend to be a much lower intake. So maybe for example, a half a pound per head per day. So if that tub is 25% crude protein and animals consume, for cattle, for example, consume only a half a pound of that, it means they're only consuming about 1/8 of a pound of protein. Okay, and that animal's overall crude protein requirement for the day may be anywhere from 2 to 3 pounds, roughly speaking, if we're talking about mature cows. Okay, so is that going to be enough to actually make a difference? All right, mineral supplementation. And this one, it maybe doesn't fit in here quite as well in terms of helping to utilize forages, but I think it's something from a nutritional management standpoint, especially for ruminants, that we keep in mind during drought times, because a good mineral supplementation program is going to be crucial during times of drought and limited forage resources. Okay, now one of the reasons for this is because we can have a winter onset tetany, so something that's very similar to grass tetany, as a result of any abrupt change in intake. Okay, if we're feeding a good quality free choice mineral supplement, we tend to minimize the chances of that happening. Okay, it needs to be provided free choice and available to the cattle 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. All right, a couple key points here to keep in mind are that we never want to cut it with salt to decrease consumption. Okay, the other thing we need to keep in mind is that trace mineralized salt will not meet mineral requirements 99.9 times out of 100. Okay, so those are not going to be replacements for a good quality free choice mineral supplementation program. Okay, if we do see that cattle or other ruminants are overeating the mineral supplement, all right, instead of cutting it with salt, we can reposition that mineral feeder maybe farther away from the water source, farther away from the feeding area, to try and give cattle more reason not to visit it. Okay, if they really need it, they're going to go seek it out and find it. So that's really our best means of decreasing intake. And again, I encourage you to never cut it with salt. We can cause some problems by doing so. All right. And one of the things we need to keep in mind from a mineral standpoint is that dormant forages, low quality hay, and crop residues tend to be much lower in mineral content than fresh pasture. Okay, so a good quality mineral supplementation program is important year round. It's very important year round, but it's even more so important when we have times of nutritional stress, such as drought or in winter when we have a lot of snow cover and we may not be able to get cattle fed on that first day of snow cover or something like that. Okay, that mineral supplement is going to be really, really important. All right, limit feeding. All right, if we limit feed cattle, that provides us the opportunity to meet their nutrient requirements without overfeeding, and that's ultimately going to help us to decrease hay waste and again prevent overfeeding. Okay, in order to do that, that's going to require a forage analysis and then interpretation of the results, either through your county extension agent or through whatever nutritionist that you regularly work with. Okay, those results can then be used to put together a supplementation plan. Right, big thing to keep in mind here, though, is that you have to be willing to commit to hand feed cattle on a daily basis. Okay. The other thing to keep in mind is that this is really only going to be effective at conserving high quality hay. Okay, because most of the time our low to medium quality hays, in terms of their nutrient content, cattle are going to need to physically consume as much of that forage as they can and then some supplement on top of that to be able to meet their requirements. Okay, but if we start thinking about limit feeding cattle, again, that's gonna increase our time and labor demands. So that's something we need to consider when we're evaluating the economics of some of these things. All right, crop residues. Crop residues, in my opinion, are far underutilized in Tennessee, and they can be effectively utilized to reduce hay needs. Now, one of the reasons why they're not as commonly utilized here as in some other states generally has to do with the fact that most of our row crop ground is not fenced and may not have waters or any source of water. So those are some things that definitely need to be considered. Okay, most of our crop residues are going to be similar in nutrient quality or content to very low quality or very mature grass hay or wheat straw. Okay, they're almost always going to require energy and protein supplementation, but that level of supplementation is going to be dependent upon stage of production and body condition. Okay, distillers grains and corn gluten feed, two commodity byproducts that we have a lot of access to here in Tennessee, pair very well with crop residues. All right, to speak a little more specifically about corn residue, one of the things that we know about corn residue is that cattle tend to eat the higher quality components first and then move on to the lower quality components. So they may eat the remaining corn that exists on the cob and then leaves and husks and cobs and then move on to stalks last. So what that means is that level of supplementation needs to increase as duration of grazing increases. So the longer the cattle spend on that field of stalks, the more we're going to have to supplement them. Okay, and generally speaking, if we're talking about a pasture-based management setting, and this changes a little bit when we start talking about confinement, but in a pasture-based setting, corn residue is going to be most economical if it's grazed rather than being harvested and then transported to the cattle. As our general rule of thumb, 1 acre of a 150 bushel per acre cornfield will maintain a 1,300-pound cow for roughly a month with a small degree of supplementation. All right, soybean residue. All right, it's going to provide much lesser forage mass when compared to corn residue. A couple rules of thumbs with grazing soybean residue is that it should never be grazed by or fed to calves that are still nursing. So this includes cow-calf pairs. Okay, never put them on soybean residue. or feed anything that has the potential to contain raw, unroasted soybeans. Okay, so cattle that go on to soybean residue or are fed any type of raw soybean product need to have been weaned for at least 1 month. Okay, and never ever, regardless of their age or production status, never feed a supplement that contains urea with soybeans or soybean residue. All right. Now, the last few more management type considerations that I'll finish up with, the first of those is going to be sorting based upon nutrient requirements. Okay, so we can sort cattle into groups based upon their stage of production and or their body condition. And once we do that, we can then devote our highest quality hay to the cattle, the highest nutrient demand. So those are going to be our first calf heifers, lactating cows, growing cattle, or cattle that are under condition, so a body condition score of less than 5. Okay, and the same concepts apply for the different production classes of the other ruminants. All right, and then we can devote our lower quality hay, or maybe even some crop residues, to cattle with the lowest nutrient demand. So those are going to be our dry cows, or cattle that we're just trying to maintain. All right, or cattle that are over conditioned, so a body condition score of greater than 6 that maybe could use to spend a little bit of time in a diet pen. All right. Early weaning is another management consideration for drought conditions. So a drought is really going to be one of the only times when early weaning is a cost-effective option for most producers. Okay, so if we wean a calf at roughly 90 to 120 days of age, that's going to reduce a cow's nutrient requirements by roughly 35% between the time we early wean and the time we would have conventionally weaned those cattle. Because when we conventionally wean cattle, their nutrient requirements also drop substantially. Okay, but in order to be able to do that, we have to be set up to intensively manage young calves that have high nutrient requirements. So really what happens is we're shifting our cost from purchasing hay to support lactating cows to purchasing feed to support the calves. Okay, so generally speaking, early wean calves will require roughly an 18% crude protein and high energy concentrate feed with free choice access to a good quality hay. All right, so those 300 to 500 pound calves, they're going to need right around 18% crude protein. As those calves get older and increase in body size, we can start to drop that crude protein content. So from 500 to 700 pounds, it's going to need to be somewhere up around 16% crude protein. When we go from 700 to 900 pounds, it can go down to 14% crude protein, and then on from there. Okay, but as we feed any type, some of the key fundamentals of ruminant nutrition hold true here. Okay, but we need to be even more careful with them when we're talking about dealing with really young calves that have been early weaned. Okay, feed must be introduced very gradually, and consistency is key. When we're making transitions, we need to think weeks instead of days. All right, and the last one that I'll finish up with before I hand it over to Jennie is strategic culling. And I'm just going to mention a few things here that Justin will spend a lot more time talking about in another webinar. But if cattle are not essential for success of the operation, we need to strongly consider removing them from the herd. Now, one thing we have to recognize is that currently the cull cow market is not conducive to culling. But one of the things that we also need to consider is that even at fairly low prices or market prices, the revenue generated from 3 or 4 open or low producing cows will buy a considerable amount of hay or supplemental feed resources. Okay, and just a few of this will be my last slide, but a few points that I think we need to consider moving forward are that drought conditions do create an opportunity to critically reevaluate our everyday management strategies. Okay, most of the management practices that I've talked about, with the exception of early weaning, are some management strategies that should be considered even when we're not in a drought. Most of our short-term drought issues are a function of overstocking. So a lot of times we may need to step back and and reevaluate, are we set up and managing cattle in the most, or other ruminants in the most appropriate way possible. You know, as we move forward, I'm afraid we are going to continue to deal with more cyclical patterns of volatile weather and climate. Okay, so it seems as if fairly recurring droughts are kind of the new thing. So something we need to consider moving forward. All right, and then for any of these things that we're doing, it's really going to be necessary to evaluate the economics of purchasing additional hay or feed resources versus decreasing cattle numbers, or really employing any of the additional management strategies that we covered, because from a labor and a management standpoint, they are all going to require some amount of additional input. So all things we need to consider moving forward. All right. With that, I'll wrap up. I'm going to check the chat box really quick.
Hey, Jason, I've been kind of monitoring the chat box here,
Okay.
and so you don't have to go through and read them. I'm going to summarize some of the questions for you. A couple of them had to do with the comments about grazing soybean residue, and one question was just to elaborate on that a little bit more. Another one here asking why the caution in feeding the soybean material to calves. Is that a nitrogen metabolism deal, fat in the soybeans? What is it? Just maybe a little bit more discussion about that. Calves eating soybean.
Absolutely. So the risk in terms of cattle consuming, especially calves consuming raw unroasted soybeans, comes from some of the anti-nutritive factors that naturally occur in the soybean. Okay, those are normally destroyed through the roasting process. So when we feed soybean meal, that bean meal had been roasted previously. That roasting process destroys the anti-nutritive factors, so it's not a concern. Well, if we have any potential for contamination or presence of those anti-nutritive factors in that bean and getting into calves, we can cause essentially an ammonia toxicity in those cattle very, very quickly. Okay, and again, there's no symptom other than dead animals. All right, so the reason young calves are much more susceptible than mature cattle or cattle with a functioning rumen is that those calves do not have that functioning rumen. So the microorganisms in the rumen are capable of destroying those anti-nutritive factors when they're fed at a fairly low level. All right, calves do not have that functional rumen. They really don't. The rumen does not function as a true rumen and as a true fermentation vat until those calves are consuming a considerable amount of dry feed and rumination is occurring. Okay, one of the reasons we never want to feed a supplement that contains urea is because that urea becomes toxic very, very quickly because of one of the urease enzymes that's in, so one of those anti-nutritive factors that's in raw soybeans that would normally be destroyed during the roasting process.
All right, good stuff. Hey, Jason, if you want to unshare your screen, and Jennie, if you want to go ahead and share your slides, as I asked Jason this last question. I had a question here about just a level, what level we can feed distillers grains to cows, mature cows, kind of what you're comfortable with there.
Okay. General rule of thumb is if we want to really avoid any negative effects on digestion of forages, we really need to stay somewhere down around 25 to 35% of the dry matter that they're consuming is coming from distillers. All right. The reason for that is because some of that is dependent upon the type of distillers, whether it's a full fat, a more conventional variety, or if it's coming from an ethanol plant that is pulling some of the fat out and sending that to biofuel refinement or biodiesel refinement. But the reason why we start to see some negative associative effects at those high levels of supplementation is because of the amount of fat, because a standard, more traditional, conventional type distiller's grains on a dry matter basis is going to be somewhere around 10% fat. All right. Well, we generally say that we're okay if cattle really from a forage-based standpoint aren't consuming more than 5 or 6% of their dry matter as fat, and from a feedlot standpoint, as long as they're not consuming more than 7 or 8% of their dry matter in fat. So the safety buffer that I like to go with is 25 to 35%. That does not mean that we can't feed more than that. I know people that have effectively fed 50 and 60 or more percent distillers grains to cattle on pasture and done fine with it. The big thing that comes into play there is whether that's cost effective or not, and that's all going to be dependent upon the cost of distillers grains to you, and also what form you're feeding them in, if you're feeding them wet, modified, or dried. But rule of thumb for safety is 25 to 35%. Now, if you're interested in feeding a lot more than that, that's where you can contact your county extension agent, and if necessary, they can contact me, and then we can help to put together a program for you to where we can minimize some of the risk associated with doing that.
Okay. Jason, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit, but I'm going to give you time to think about it. So think for a second if you can think anything specific for small ruminant goat and sheep producers that might be different than what you talked about here. While you think about that, I'm going to ask Peter. Peter, do you have anything that you might want to add for dairy production that hasn't been covered here? I think most of it's going to be, pretty similar for ruminants, but.
Justin, I don't. I would just echo what Jason said, especially about feeding byproducts. Usually it seems about 20 or so % is the rule of thumb to use and incorporating those in the diets.
Good deal. Thanks, Peter. So Dr. Loveday had to jump off and go teach class, Jason, so that's why I have the small ruminant.
No problem. I think the big thing, all the concepts still apply. The big thing that's different is that a lot of times with our small ruminants, they're going to have, if we think proportional, they're going to have a much higher crude protein requirement, especially if ewes or does are lactating, and also dependent upon how many lambs or kids they have on them. And so that's where our supplementation is going to need to be higher. Our quality of forage is going to need to be higher. Okay. A lot of times we're going to have to purchase that forage anyway, whether we're talking about alfalfa or just a really good quality mixed legume and grass hay. And so if we look at the expenses associated with that, if we're feeding it in a way that there's a lot of hay waste, that proportionally, that's a lot more expensive than if we're doing it with a low or a moderate quality forage. So need to really, really think critically about feeding them in a way that's going to decrease that hay waste. From a supplementation standpoint, we know corn can be worth its weight in gold at certain times for small ruminants. And so this is where a situation where we can probably think about trying to push the amount of corn supplementation towards the max for our small ruminants without starting to cause some problems. And we're looking at a couple pounds per head per day type supplementation, but if we look at cost per unit of nutrient, it's going to be an effective means of taking some pressure off of the forages, but also not sacrificing productivity. Hopefully that answers that question.
Sure. And most of the reason I asked that is, this kind of quick turnaround on publicizing these, and might not have had time for some small ruminant producers to have found this and hooked up, but hopefully they'll be able to watch the recording and get some of that from the overall discussion of ruminant management, but also, some of that to specifically to small ruminants. So, yeah, appreciate that. Okay. Absolutely. With that, Jennie, I'm going to turn it over to you, and we'll keep on going with talking about equids.
Sounds good. Thank you, Justin. So we'll kind of switch gears a little bit here, but you'll kind of see a lot of the general management that we recommend for horses, just from, how do we look for hay, how do we manage hay, and how do we feed it, actually echo a lot of what Jason had mentioned earlier. So as we know, kind of just a brief overview, most of you are probably already experiencing this. Coming out of this summer, that we saw some reduced pasture grazing time, which can sometimes lead to an increased wheat consumption for our horses. And so, really kind of keeping this in mind, especially as we move maybe into the spring and start to see some of the effects of this drought on our forage sources, we can see some, toxic weeds, or have those horses kind of preferentially select for some of these forage sources that we wouldn't normally see them consume. We're also seeing a decreased hay production, and we'll talk a little bit about kind of where to look for these and how to try and maximize where you can find some hay sources during the winter. And also plant stress. So, having those forages, be deprived of some of the nutrients that they needed, and affecting the growth overall due to that diminished water supply, is definitely, can be of concern, especially if we've got horses that are grazing some of our less than ideal species. I know that finding water supply will be our topic of discussion for tomorrow, so I won't spend too much time on it there, but just, kind of keeping in mind that water consumption needs and daily requirements for water have not changed for horses, and especially maybe as we're eating some lower quality forages throughout the winter, making sure that your horses have adequate supply is very important. And then I know in a future date, we'll also talk a little bit about the ability to plant and reseed and kind of manage some of those pastures in a way that still makes them productive for you in the future. But the one I kind of want to talk about here a little bit more today is from the livestock welfare side, and kind of feeding for body condition and being able to plan ahead before you get to a point where it's more concerning for that horse. So real quick, just to touch on body condition scoring for those owners that are not familiar with this system. It is a really simple, fast, objective system that allows us to assess different body fat deposition across the horse's body. And so we can do this in a couple different ways. Usually we prefer visual and physical evaluation at the same time, but if visual is all you can achieve, that's all right too. But we want to avoid either extreme, and that's kind of what's illustrated in these pictures for you. And so you can see the upper image, the horse is grossly overweight, but has some exaggerated fat pockets over certain areas that we would identify when doing body condition scoring on horses. And then obviously the horse at the bottom is much thinner than we would like, and being able to kind of figure out where your horse falls in between these or at those particular scores and how to feed them throughout. And so there's a variety of different factors that can influence this system, whether it be age or breed, and what we consider ideal. So for example, if we have a mare that's pregnant, we know she's going to foal out early in the year, her ideal body condition score may be different than just that horse standing out in the pasture. So I've included this table, and I apologize that it looks a little blurry, but it is part of one of our extension publications, so you can kind of look through and be able to see where these actually fall, and how to complete this particular process on your horse. And I won't spend too much time on it, but I kind of want to illustrate for you, we'd like those horses to be somewhere between about a 4 to a 6. And that's kind of that middle image that we see on the right-hand side. Not too fleshy, not too thin, not too fat. And that's kind of what we're targeting for. So if you have a lot of horses that sit out in the pasture that kind of look like the bottom image, or maybe even a little fuller, it might be a good time for us to kind of evaluate some forage options during this drought, and be able to select to help them lose weight. On the flip side, if we have that thin horse that we're trying to put weight back on, kind of some of the forages that may be more available at the moment from our traditional standpoints may not be the best suited to be able to allow that horse to put weight back on. So we'll talk kind of as we move through here, how we feed these horses and why we want to feed them the way that we do. And so I really want to kind of drive the point home that horses really need that forage first in their diet. Because of the way the digestive system is set up, that hindgut is really doing all of the fermentation that we would consider from the rumen of that ruminant animal. And so ideally what we're going to see is an intake of between 2 to 2.5% of body weight on a dry matter basis per day from forages or fiber sources alone. And this usually is enough to meet our horses' maintenance needs, even up through light to moderate work, early pregnancy, and maybe even late lactation. But unfortunately, with the drought that we're seeing, we may not be able to achieve these with our traditional forage sources that we would rely upon in the past, and also with maybe a higher fiber content within them than we would like to see, it may be hard for those horses to intake as well. So at a minimum, if we're looking to kind of conserve the forage that we have, horses need to intake 1% of their body weight per day on a dry matter basis. So for that 1,000-pound horse, they need at least 10 pounds of hay on a dry matter basis per day. And really knowing what your horse weighs and what that body condition score is very important. So there are publications online that you can look for and use to estimate your horse's body weight if you don't have access to a scale. And then again, the body condition scoring publication that I referenced earlier. And so the big piece to kind of think about here and remember is that we can't cut forage out of the diet completely. It's not something that can be entirely replaced. Horses need that 1% of body weight in an intake to promote proper gut health and provide that energy requirement. And so where can we find hay? Obviously utilizing your county extension agent is very important. I've also included 2 links here that might just be able to help you locate different sources that you may not have used in the past. Also, I would encourage you, if there's other horse owners in your area or you have a larger scale breeding, boarding barn, anything like that, to consider purchasing hay from a different area and utilizing that shipping cost to be split amongst others to be able to bring in hay if you're not able to find it here. But first, really going back to that forage test. What does that forage provide your horse and what nutrients are missing that we need to make sure that we supplement with either through a concentrate or something different? That is really the best way for us to be able to tell what that horse is ingesting and what is needed to be able to keep them at a healthy nutrient balance. And so we can really prevent overfeeding and reduce waste by weighing the hay per day. So again, if you think back to that previous slide where we talked about that horse needing a minimum of 1% of their body weight in forage per day, by weighing that out each day, you know that you're delivering that to the animal and we can really help to reduce waste. Instead of, just placing an entire bale out to maybe last a week or being able to put an entire round bale out. If that is the easiest way for you to manage your horses, and it's really impossible to be able to roll out and weigh out hay per day in specific feedings, make sure that you're using some sort of a hay feeder, something to help pick that hay up off the ground, prevent the horses from urinating and defecating on it, and then overall reducing waste. Most of the averages for horse owners for reported waste usually range between 20 and 40%. So that's a huge amount of waste overall, especially when we're trying to conserve these forage options. As I mentioned, we may see an increased weed consumption. So if you look out in your pastures and they're full of weeds and your horses really aren't touching the hay, I would venture to guess that they're probably consuming some of those weeds. And if they do have a toxic ability, we want to make sure that we're monitoring that as well. And then kind of the latter portion here, what we'll talk about is utilizing forage replacers and what are some of the options for you if we need to supplement the fiber portion of the diet. So when we look at that, I want to make sure that we make kind of a few of these points clear for you, that concentrates and feeding forage replacers are different. So our concentrates, more of our grains or grain byproducts, they should not exceed 50% of the total diet. So we don't want to just replace the forage completely with some sort of a concentrate feed because of a few different nutritional reasons. Mainly that those concentrate feeds don't usually have a high enough fiber concentration to be able to support the hindgut. And there's also some different concentrations of other nutrients in there that don't really make for the best process as they get fermented within the hindgut of the horse. And so the easiest way to prevent a lot of these problems that we see with concentrate overfeeding, like colic and laminitis, is to not feed more than 0.75% of your horse's body weight per feeding. So again, for that 1,000-pound horse, we don't want to feed more than 7.5 pounds of concentrate per feeding. If your horse needs more than that, that's when we want to make sure that we split it into 2 or 3 separate feedings. The other is watch for wood chewing. So this is different than cribbing overall. This is where horses are actually ingesting wood, again, to be able to increase their fiber consumption during the day. And so because of that, we want to make sure that we're not having any sort of issue with that fiber intake overall. And so with our, maybe poorer quality forages or things that are a little bit more mature when they get cut, some of the risks that we see are impaction colic, so making sure that those horses have enough water, that we transition over to those different forage sources with enough time, usually over about a week to 2 weeks. Watch for weight loss. Again, monitoring those horses for their body condition score and potential nutrient deficits. So this is why, again, the forage test is really important. And then utilizing concentrates only when we need to be able to make up for that nutrient deficit to meet the horse's nutrient requirements per day. So some of our forage sources that we can utilize that are kind of outside our traditional thought process might be some processed forages, whether in the form of hay cubes, hay pellets, or in chopped or bagged forms. But if you are searching and thinking about utilizing this particular forage option, really kind of preferentially select for that chopped, cubed, or bagged form if possible. And the reason for that is that the fiber size and the particle size that are contained within these hay cubes are larger than that within the pellet. And you can kind of get a general idea for that, even though the zoom is different on these two images. But that higher fiber size is actually better for overall gut health, increased forage utilization within the hindgut, and then also increased water holding capacity of the hindgut as well. So that's one of the major areas that horses will hold on to water and utilize it as a reservoir to stay hydrated. If you do have some geriatric horses or horses that have issues chewing or maybe even just eating these particular forage replacers in general, we can soak them. But I would caution you to make sure that the soaking process just is enough to allow those pellets or those hay cubes to really just break apart and be edible by the horse. If we soak them to the point that there's a big pool of water at the bottom of the bucket, we're actually getting some nutrient leaching, specifically those non-structural carbohydrates and some proteins that we may not want to lose. So again, just be considerate of the fact that we want to have those pellets be soaked or those cubes be soaked, but not kind of swimming in a soup of liquid. And kind of the overall piece here, and something that you'll see kind of throughout the forage selection process, is that a lot of these forages are going to be more expensive. So especially when we move to maybe a cube or something in a bagged form, you're looking at upwards of $20 or more for 50 pounds. So if we go back to what that horse needs per day at about 20 to 25 pounds per day on a dry matter basis to meet their maintenance needs, we're going to be looking at about 2 bags or one bag of forage replacer every 2 days. So it can be fairly costly compared to our traditional forage sources. Also kind of looking at some other options. So soybean hulls are ones that we can include, and in some studies have shown that we can replace up to 3/4 of the diet in mature horses with soybean hulls as long as they're on another good quality hay. So again, maybe we could utilize some soybean hulls to supplement that forage and then kind of put them on some sort of an alfalfa cube or alfalfa pellet. Looking at the fiber content and the non-structural carbohydrate content that I've included for you within the table, if you look, we kind of can see that those soy hulls have a higher fiber content than our grass hay on average, but they are lower in non-structural carbs. So this might be a really good option for those horses with metabolic syndrome or insulin resistance. They do have a little bit higher digestible energy, so we want to make sure that if we are supplementing at a high rate, we're watching for excessive weight gain. And part of that, and one of the considerations if you are going to be utilizing soybean hulls as a forage replacer, is that they are often compounded with molasses to help increase palatability and reduce dust. For those horses with metabolic syndrome, or if we're feeding it at a high level, it will increase the non-structural carbohydrate content and can potentially cause that starch spillover, resulting in colic and laminitis. So again, making sure that you're not feeding too much of it at one time. Overall, soybean hulls can be vitamin deficient, so we want to make sure that if we're utilizing this particular forage replacer, getting horses on some sort of a vitamin supplement is very important. And there are a couple other hulls that we can utilize kind of with some of the same cautions, but often rice hulls are not used here just because they tend to be a little sharper. But overall, if you can find some, oat or peanut hulls, we can utilize them as a forage replacer as well. Beet pulp is kind of our next option and is one that's very widely utilized across the horse industry. And it does have a pretty high water holding capacity, which is really nice, especially for those horses that are having trouble chewing. But I want to kind of bring your attention to the fact that the second point, beet pulp does tend to be higher on average in energy than alfalfa pellets, and almost that near oats. So again, if we're feeding it in high quantities, especially to those easy keepers, they may see an increased weight gain over what we would have expected on a traditional forage source. What is nice is that they are lower in non-structural carbs, so they're usually a pretty safe bet if they're not compounded with molasses for your insulin-resistant metabolic syndrome horses. And we can incorporate this at a fairly high level into the diet. So about 45% beet pulp and 55% alfalfa has been fed. And if you work that out, that works out to about 10 pounds on a dry matter basis. So we can almost replace that, the rest of the diet with this particular forage replacer and see a pretty good response. And so really quickly, I just kind of want to show you this table. And I know it may be different for some of you, but if we look at beet pulp across the top line, we see about 20% of fiber contained in this feed. And that's really important because we want that fiber percent ideally above 15%, if not higher, if we're utilizing it as a forage replacer for horses. So if we look, comparing it to oats that come in at around 11% on average, oats would not be considered a fiber replacer, but beet pulp is for that reason. And we can see that the energy content is upwards near oats again, so it's a really great option for those older horses, performance horses that need more energy, the geriatric horse that's having trouble keeping weight on. So for all those reasons, beet pulp can be a really great option. And if we look at it compared to the hay, we see that it is a little bit higher than both the alfalfa and the timothy with regard to energy, but lower in fiber. So again, we want to make sure that we balance it with a little something within the diet that has a higher fiber content if possible. But I do want to make sure that we kind of talk really quickly about this because it is something that throughout the equine industry has been talked about a lot. But beet pulp is fine to be fed soaked or dry. Okay, that's one of the big kind of things that a lot of horse owners don't like about this product. They thought it always had to be soaked. If you are feeding it unsoaked or you're feeding it as a dry, just make sure that you provide that horse with extra water so that way they can drink ad libitum. You can soak if that's your preference in warm or cold water. Usually about an hour will be fine to let that beet pulp kind of soften up a little bit. But I do also want to mention that in horses that are older or have poor dentition, or you know that you have a horse that is a history of choke or doesn't chew their feed, soaking is recommended because again, horses only produce saliva when they're actively chewing. So in that pelleted form where they don't have to chew it like a traditional hay, you may see them bolt that feed. So that would be a time to soak as well. Some other cautions if you're feeding beet pulp at higher concentrations. We do see it increased and compounded with molasses for those particular palatability and dust reasons, which causes a problem for two of our horse classes primarily. Again, that metabolic syndrome insulin-resistant horse, but also our HYPP horses, that hyperkalemic periodic paralysis genetic disease that we see in the quarter horse line from Impressive. So watch if you do have an HYPP horse or you're managing one of them, if replacing with beet pulp containing molasses, the high levels of potassium in molasses can impact their overall function and cause you some other management problems, and also can negatively impact magnesium metabolism. So again, just keep that in mind if you're utilizing this and try and find a source that is not compounded with molasses if that is the case. Beet pulp is also fairly low in phosphorus. So if we're feeding at high concentrations, you will have to supplement with that mineral as well. And again, getting that forage test will let us kind of see what's provided from the other sources of the diet. Kind of our last forage replacer that we'll talk about from a traditional sense is rice or wheat bran. So especially through the winter, a lot of horse owners will sometimes do a bran mash. And the thought and kind of the myth behind that was that it should help to keep the digestive system moving during the winter as horses transition off pasture. What we see is that that's not necessarily the case, but what typically does happen is because we've introduced the new feed source to that horse and to that horse's diet, it does produce a laxative effect because that hindgut and the GI system overall is not used to seeing it. So I would not recommend just throwing in a bran mash every once in a while, but if we are going to utilize rice or wheat bran as a forage replacer, we can utilize that to a certain level. But I would caution you that it is very high in phosphorus. So when we want that calcium to phosphorus ratio at 2 parts calcium to 1 part phosphorus at a minimum, feeding high amounts of rice or wheat bran can negatively impact that ratio and be very challenging to reverse. Even though the calcium level is similar to oats, again, with that higher phosphorus, it can be a problem, especially for that young growing horse or the lactating mare. It also has this high starch content, so feeding in large quantities is not recommended, again, because of starch spillover, and especially for those horses that may be insulin resistant. And our last piece to kind of talk about are what we consider those complete feeds, or what they're marketing as more of a commercially available forage replacer. Usually you'll see these marketed towards the equine senior. Because of that poor dentition, they're utilizing this as a way to be able to replace the hay or other forage component of the diet. And because it is higher than that 15% crude fiber, we're able to replace a lot of the forage within the feed this way. The thing that I would caution you is that it is designed to be fed in very high quantities. So if you look at the feed tag and look at how this is, excuse me, look at how this feed is designed to be fed. For that average 1,000-pound animal, they should be eating somewhere between 25 to 30 pounds per day. So we're going to be cruising through a lot of this feed if used in the appropriate manner. And the big caveat and kind of take-home message here is that crude fiber in the feed is inversely related to energy. So what that means is it's like a seesaw. As fiber increases, energy decreases. And the reason that that's important is that if you're switching to this feed, or you're switching to a senior or a complete feed off of more of our performance feeds, your horse will typically overall be taking in less energy per day than they would be on that traditional concentrate. And so often we will see weight loss, which can be challenging to manage if we're not utilizing this feed properly. So again, as a forage replacer, if you're choosing to utilize a complete feed, make sure you feed it at the appropriate rates to make sure that your horse is not going into a negative energy balance. And I kind of want to illustrate this point with the feed tag here as we wrap up. But these are just 2 different feeds from a commercially available setting. And it's just as an illustration, not anything wrong with this particular company whatsoever. They're a great company. But it is a 12-6 plus lysine performance feed, and then a senior feed from the same line. And so if we look at the definitions here, we've got a 12% protein with added lysine for working or pregnant mares, and be designed to be fed with a medium to high quality hay. And so this particular feed is telling you it is not meant to be a forage replacer. So we can't replace the entire diet's fiber content with this particular feed, which is different than what we see for the senior or the complete feed, which is saying that it has adequate roughage built in to address the issues for older horses chewing and digesting forage. So this would be an option that if you do need something to help stretch that hay or that forage source, utilizing a complete feed might be a good option. And if we look at the guaranteed analysis from these 2 different feeds, what we see is that if we look at that crude fiber content, we're at 18.5% for senior, which is, again, over that minimum of 15%. But we know that with increased fiber, we see decreased energy content within the feed. And so, again, a really good option, a very well-balanced feed, but we need to make sure that we're providing it at the level that it's recommended. And so knowing I was probably heading last, I figured we'd throw this up here for you that our drought webinar for tomorrow, we'll go over watering, and it is at noon again. So hopefully that was helpful for you, and I'll check the chat here and see if we've got any questions or go from there.
I'm kind of keeping a watch here too, Jennie. I haven't seen any come in while you were talking. Let's give everybody an opportunity if they like to ask some questions about the equine component or anything that Jason or the others have covered so far. You can go ahead and type those in. One thing I thought to mention, or was thinking to mention, and Jennie, appreciate you following up with that too, is about the emergency watering webinar that'll be coming up tomorrow and will be posted to record too. If you're watching this as a recording, you can go back and watch that as well. But that'll be given by Brian Live. He's one of our faculty in ag engineering and had done some work on a lot of different ways to go about emergency watering during a drought situation back in 2012 when we did some drought response work. So that'll cover everything from hauling water to pumping water and some specifics of when you're putting in pipes and pumps and hauling water, and some discussion about economics, those types of things as well. So it should be very good. Jennie, I just thought of a question for you as I was going through that. Jason mentioned some things about putting cattle on crop residues. If there's a horse owner that might be near a row crop field or something, could use a little poly wire to let horses in on that. Would that be something you could do and manage well enough to be out of, clear and safe to do something like that with horses?
Yeah, I mean, it partially just kind of depends on what crop residues we're working with. Some of them just are not particularly palatable, or might provide, just because of the higher kind of fiber content within there, might cause some issues with impaction colic overall. I have seen some, just kind of do some cleanup grazing or allow that, co-species grazing if they're doing that, and kind of sparing some of those preferential forages for their horses. But it really just kind of depends overall. Species like if there are any, and I know it's kind of off the crop topic, but any Johnson grass, Sudan grass, things like that, we don't recommend for horses to graze in high quantities. So just kind of keeping an eye on those, especially because in those stress situations, we do see horses have a little bit more sensitivity and a higher toxicity than others. So it just would kind of depend on what we've got. And I would encourage them to talk to their county agents or work with me to be able to figure out the best management strategy for that.
Yeah. I like the fact that you mentioned about the weed pressure in the coming spring from some losses that might have been incurred this year. So that'll be something to look out for. And I've talked to Dr. Bates about doing a webinar on that later. And so that'll be something we'll have another opportunity to address, but certainly need to keep that in mind as we prepare to come out of the winter into the spring.
Hey, Justin, one thing that Jennie just mentioned, and I think we should mention related to ruminants with the drought pressure, is if we had any forages that were heavily fertilized with nitrogen before being harvested and then drought stressed after that application, we definitely want to be conducting a forage analysis on that hay before we feed it. Because it may contain nitrates that could be toxic to ruminants. So definitely from a preventative standpoint, again, that's one of those scenarios where nitrate toxicity, the first symptoms are dead animals. And so if we had, even if it wasn't intentional nitrogen fertilization, if we have areas where we know there's going to be a lot of nitrate runoff too, or really heavy manure fertilizer application or anything like that, we definitely want to be testing that forage before we're feeding it to determine or to ensure that it does indeed have a safe level of nitrates in it, or not a level that would cause a problem in the animals.
Yeah, definitely. Very good point. I think that Dr. Bates has a publication on that, so we'll put that up on the Drought website as well, and ask him to incorporate that into his forage discussion when we get that planned. I have a question here on the chat box about, looks like in West Tennessee they'll be planting some ryegrass on into December if they get enough moisture to do that. Just counting on that to be available for some spring growth. As that spring growth comes on, just some tips maybe for grazing management, how best to utilize that ryegrass as it comes on. I'll mention that, kind of going back to the concept of limit grazing if you can. I had some experience, quite a bit of experience with using ryegrass pastures when I worked for Mississippi State, and that was a pretty common theme, especially when they had some limited growth from poor establishment. If it's still dry, those kinds of things would be to turn cattle in for just a few hours to graze, maybe even twice a day if you can stand to do it. And of course, that adds up to more labor, but it's one of those situations where we're going to have to do some things maybe a little differently to cope with the drought and just deal with what we have. So I think that limit grazing, turning in, turning out, or using some polywire or some electric fencing, mobile electric fencing to stagger that, how much is available to those animals, and trying to keep them from beating it down too much to stay in a rotation to keep getting as much use out of that spring growth as we can. You guys have anything else to add to that?
Yeah, one thing, or go ahead, Jenny.
You're sorry, you're fine. I would say that I would agree with that, especially from the horse perspective. We tend to see a higher stocking rate than what's recommended for horses. Ideally we'd like that one horse per 2 to 2.5, sometimes even 3 acres, and very rarely is that the case. So if you're trying to manage those kind of newer stands and really stretch what's out there in your pastures, limiting grazing time and really managing that overall would be your best way to preserve that from the equine side.
And one thing that I'd add, or a few things that I'd add from the beef cattle grazing standpoint, is that one of the issues we run into when we start grazing some of the cool season annuals is that moisture or overall water intake can become problematic at a certain level. And a lot of those forages, if we do have adequate moisture, will be upwards of 80 to sometimes even close to 85% water. So if we can try to get some additional source of dry matter into the cattle, it seems to work really well. So if that's a medium quality or high quality hay just set out for them to nibble on free choice. Will they waste some of it? Sure, but it does work really well at slowing down passage rate and diluting some of that water out. One of the other things we need to think about is those forages generally are very high in potassium, and they're essentially above the level of what we consider the critical threshold for developing grass tetany. And so it becomes really important to make sure that cattle have free choice access to a high magnesium mineral supplement when they're grazing weed or annual ryegrass pasture. Big thing to keep in mind there is that they're not all created equally, and cattle really don't like the taste of magnesium. And so the big thing there is to find that high mag mineral supplement that the cattle will actually consume. Other risks that we tend to run into is bloat. And so a few of the things that we can do to minimize that risk is one, to always be feeding in ionophore. So either Rumensin or Bovatec would be the product names for those. And they'll increase production efficiency, but they'll also decrease bloat risks. They've been shown a number of times to be effective at doing so. Big thing to keep in mind is they're not 100% effective bloat preventative. And so one of the other compounds that we have that is probably more so effective at decreasing the incidence of bloat is a compound called paloxylene. The trade name it goes by is Bloat Guard. And so you tend to be able to find certain supplements, whether they're in block form or maybe even in free choice form, that have that compound in them. So if we can find that high mag block or something like that, and maybe a pressed block that contains paloxylene or bloat guard, we can do a really good job of minimizing that risk. Other thing that cattle on cool season annuals tend to benefit from is some additional energy supplementation, especially as that forage gets older and starts to mature. And so right now, corn is one of our most effective means of doing that, as well as, Ron, in your area, being that in terms of proximity to ethanol, distillers grains still work really, really well there. And as that forage starts to increase in maturity and protein level starts to decrease, the high level of protein in the distillers will definitely complement that.
And want to give everybody a chance to, if you have some more questions, if you want to type those in. I'll just make one more comment too on the drought situation. I'll try to remember to bring this up as well in the forage discussion that we'll do later, pasture management kind of thing. But I recall coming out of the drought of 2007, I believe it was, I had some situations where we had lost so much fescue stand that when the clover started to come on, and it was a situation where the volunteer white clover came on pretty hot and heavy before the grass did, so much that it crowded out some fescue growth and looked like there were pastures with monocultures of white clover, and we lost a lot of cattle to bloat in that situation. I recall the governor of Kentucky even declared a couple of counties drought or disaster situation so that they were able to indemnify some of the cow herds. Had lost 20 and 30% of their cows from bloat on those when those clover came out like they did. So something to watch about and think about as we go into spring. But even thinking about that now and kind of getting ready to combat bloat with long stem hay or paloxylene, like Jason's mentioned there, something definitely to keep in mind. Any other comments from the panelists, Peter, Jennie, Jason, anything else to say? I just wanted to kind of stall a minute here and see if anybody had any other questions to type in.
Justin, there's a question for Jennie from Kristen Clark. It reads, would it be worth spreading grass seed in horse paddocks before winter, or is it better to wait in the spring?
So from my knowledge, and I'm not a pasture management specialist, but making sure that having some moisture in that ground for that seed to really take is very important. And so I would encourage you to visit and sign on during that pasture management section, but I would say waiting until we've got at least a little bit of moisture on the ground before you spread that seed to make sure that you're not wasting it would be very important. So whether that comes hopefully in the next couple weeks or it comes later on, being able to utilize that timing would be the most beneficial for you. As far as just being able to have something in the field for your horses to graze, without that moisture and without that ability for those seeds to really germinate and grow, you're not going to see much of it if we're not able to find that timing. So that's where, utilizing some other forage replacer in the meantime until you can get that stand established. Hopefully, again, it will be sooner rather than later, but if you want, I'll shoot you my email through here and we'll be able to get that answered for you in a little bit more detail once we're off the webinar.
And definitely, if you're watching this recording, or those of you that are still on here with us live, watch for when we're able to schedule that pasture management webinar with Dr. Bates and probably Dr. Rhodes as well from a weed management standpoint. I'm kind of concerned about what that's going to look like in the spring. So make sure to watch for that and sign on whenever we get that up and scheduled. It'll be a lot better, probably more specific discussion about that kind of timing. So I got another question here. It said, not sure how many producers we have on, but might want to put a plug in for the Livestock Forage Program, Farm Service Agency. Yeah, program's starting to kick progress to drought. So I've talked to some of the folks in Farm Service Agency and NRCS, and they've already started to respond to this, and actually saw that there was a webinar between NOAA and USDA for Tennessee specific drought discussions. So we'll list all that stuff on the drought response website that these webinar recordings will be on. But do reach out and look for those other entities in the state and in your county that you can work through to get some assistance. EQIP probably starting to trigger on those as far as watering systems and alternative watering, feeding pads, all that kinds of stuff. So we'll try to cross-link, cross-reference as much as that as we can with our materials, but definitely reach out and look at those other state and federal entities that might be able to offer some assistance. Yeah, thank you for mentioning that, Nick. Any other questions or comments? Comments from the panelists, questions from the viewers? Okay. All right. Seeing none, I appreciate the panelists, Jason and Jennie and Peter and Dr. Loveday that was on earlier for being willing to do this and get this recorded so people can get access to it and watch it later. Maybe some of you that are on will want to go back and review it too. So look for more information as we continue to compile that on the just go to UT Extension or to utbeef.com or to uthorse.com and look for that information. Always kind of the first line of questioning. You have front door to the University of Tennessee in every county with your county ag natural resources agents. So check with them, and if they don't have the answer off the top of their head, they know how to find the people that do. So hopefully we can be of some assistance as you try to cope with the drought, and anything we can do short of making it rain, just let us know.